What happens when one of music's most legendary icons goes head-to-head with late night's most controversial host? Last night, the world watched in disbelief as Cher sat down with Jimmy Kimmel and what was supposed to be a light-hearted promotional interview erupted into one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. The fallout has rocked Hollywood, sparked endless headlines, and left millions of viewers stunned. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, be sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment below, because what you're about to hear isn't just entertainment history, it's a wake-up call. It all began like any other Tuesday night on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Cher-iconic singer, Oscar-winning actress, and cultural powerhouse arrived to promote her new documentary and upcoming tour. At 77, she looked radiant in a flowing black ensemble, her signature hair cascading past her shoulders. She'd done hundreds of interviews over the decades. This was supposed to be just another one, but from the moment she stepped onto that stage, something felt off. The usual warmth of a celebrity sit-down was missing. Kimmel, known for his biting wit, seemed on edge. His welcome felt stiff, even rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Cher," he announced with a grin. But to those watching closely, the enthusiasm seemed forced. Cher took her seat gracefully, waving to the crowd like the seasoned performer she is. The first few minutes played out as expected banter about her documentary, stories from her early career, reflections on 6 decades in show business. The crowd was riveted. But then came the shift. Kimmel's questions grew sharper, his tone more pointed. Viewers could feel the tension creeping in beneath the surface. "You know, Cher," he said, reclining smugly in his chair, "you've been really vocal about politics lately. Some people say celebrities should stick to entertaining and leave the serious stuff to politicians." The studio fell silent. Cher's expression barely changed, but anyone who knows her could see it: the flicker in her eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. "Well, Jimmy," she said smoothly, "I've lived long enough to know that staying silent in the face of injustice isn't an option, not for me, and not for anyone with a voice." The audience erupted in applause. But Kimmel wasn't done. "But don't you think there's a responsibility?" he pressed. "When you have a platform that big, when you tweet something to millions, shouldn't you be more careful with the message you're sending?" That's when everything changed. That word, careful, landed like a slap. For a woman who spent a lifetime being underestimated, dismissed, and told to stay in her lane, it was a trigger. Decades of patronizing interviews, headlines, questioning, her intelligence networks trying to silence her convictions, all of it came flooding back in that moment. She leaned forward. "Careful," she repeated, her voice rising. "Jimmy, I've been careful my whole life. I was careful when they told me I couldn't sing, careful when they told me I'd never make it past 30, careful when I used my voice to fight for people who didn't have one." Her tone was calm, but her words were fire. "And you want to talk about responsibility? How about the responsibility of a host to listen, not lecture? To respect that maybe, just maybe, someone who's been breaking ground for 60 years might have something worth saying?" The audience was stunned. Even Kimmel looked caught off guard, fumbling for a comeback that never came. The moment hung in the air, heavy, real, unforgettable. In just a few minutes, Cher did what few have dared to do. She flipped the script, turned the interview on its head, and reminded the world why her voice still matters. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a reckoning. "I was careful," Cher said, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "Careful when they told me I couldn't act. Careful when they told me to keep my mouth shut about the things that mattered." She paused, scanning the room with eyes that had seen the very best and worst of the entertainment world. "And you know what all that carefulness got me? Pushed around, talked over, undermined by men who thought they always knew better." The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. This was not the breezy celebrity chatter they'd come expecting. The mood had shifted. The tension was real. Kimmel, sensing he may have struck a deeper nerve than he intended, tried to lighten the mood, his old fallback. "Hey," he said, with an awkward chuckle, "I'm just saying with great power comes great responsibility." A Spider-Man reference. The joke landed with all the grace of a lead balloon. "Maybe we could all use a little more Spider-Man wisdom in our Twitter feeds." He smiled, but the moment had passed. The room was too heavy, the stakes too real. Cher's expression hardened. Suddenly, she wasn't just a guest on a talk show. She was the warrior who'd conquered stage, screen, and stereotype. Are you seriously comparing my political advocacy to a comic book character? She asked, her voice sharp as glass. There was no laughter, only stunned silence. Jimmy, I've used my platform to fight for veterans, for LGBTQ+ rights, for justice. Long before it was trendy, longer than some of your audience has been alive. The audience began to murmur quietly at first. They knew something was unfolding. Before them, that wasn't scripted. This wasn't just a segment gone off the rails. It was a collision of two very different ideas about fame, responsibility, and truth. Kimmel, clearly flustered, made the fatal error of doubling down instead of diffusing. "Look, Cher, I respect your passion," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "but sometimes I wonder if celebrities like yourself really understand how complex these issues are. I mean, do you really think a pop star's opinion on foreign policy carries the same weight as someone who's actually studied it?" The words hit like a slap. Cher's face flushed not with embarrassment, but fury. He had just reduced her legacy, her activism, her decades of public service to a pop star. She straightened in her chair, her voice suddenly ice cold. "A pop star," she echoed. "Jimmy, I've been fighting for causes you probably couldn't even pronounce. When I started my career, I've testified before Congress, I've worked with humanitarian organizations around the globe, and I've put my money and my name behind every cause I believe in." The crowd fell completely silent. No applause, no laughter, just a studio, full of people holding their breath. Even the camera operators paused, transfixed by the raw confrontation. Kimmel, now visibly nervous, tried to salvage the exchange. "Hey, I'm not trying to attack you," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying maybe there's value in listening to the experts instead of celebrity Twitter accounts, that's all." But his tone betrayed him. It wasn't curiosity, it was dismissal. The words hung in the air like smoke, and then Cher stood up, abrupt, powerful, all 5 of her towering over the host in stunned silence. The room froze. Her voice was low but laced with authority, each syllable delivered with surgical precision. "Listen to experts," she took a step forward. "I've spent decades listening to experts, working with them, funding them, marching. Beside them, I've used my voice to amplify theirs. You think tweeting is all I do? Jimmy, I've been in this fight longer than you've been in television. You invited me here to talk about my work, but what you really wanted was to remind me to stay in my lane. Well, guess what? I paved this lane." The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, and gasps collided all at once. Jimmy Kimmel, caught completely off guard, sat frozen, unable to regain control of the moment or the narrative in one breathtaking exchange. Cher reminded the world who she wasn't, why her voice will never be silenced. "Jimmy," Cher said, steady and clear, "I am an expert." The room held its breath. "I'm an expert on what it means to be marginalized, on what it takes to fight for a place in a world that never wanted you to speak up, on what it means to use whatever platform you have, no matter how small or temporary, to try and make it better for someone else." She stared directly at him, unblinking. "You sit behind this desk night after night, making snide jokes about politicians and celebrities. But tell me, Jimmy Wynn, have you ever put yourself on the line for something that actually mattered?" Hush fell across the studio. Not silent stillness, the kind that happens right before an earthquake. Kimmel's face drained of color. The audience watched him shrink in real time, realizing his guest had stopped playing the game. "Cher, please let's just—" he started. She cut him off with a swift flick of her hand, as commanding as a gavel. "No, you don't get to, Cher, please me after that." Her voice rose, not in volume, but in foresharp, resonant, final. "You want to talk about celebrity Twitter accounts? Let me tell you about mine. When I tweet about veterans, it's because I've spent years working with wounded warriors. When I tweet about civil rights, it's because I marched for equality. And when I speak out about humanitarian crises, it's because I've been there. I've seen the suffering with my own eyes." Behind the cameras, the production crew stood frozen. No one dared cut to commercial. They all knew this was history. Kimmel, now visibly sweating under the lights, attempted one last pivot, the fatal kind. Okay, maybe we're getting a little heated here," he said with a strained laugh. "Let's all just take a deep breath. right? We're all friends here. This is supposed to be fun, remember?" He smiled nervously, gesturing toward her as if she were just being emotional, irrational. It was a mistake, a massive one. Cher didn't flinch. She leaned in, her tone dropping to a razor's whisper, sharp, cold, deliberate. "Friends," she let the word hang deadly in its softness. "Friends don't ambush each other on live television. Friends don't dismiss each other's life's work as celebrity nonsense. And friends sure as hell don't tell each other to take a deep breath when they're calling out disrespect." The room was so quiet, the hum of the cameras became audible. Even the audience, restless and vocal just minutes earlier, sat locked in place. Kimmel's forced grin faltered. And then another misstep. "All right, look," he said, voice now tinged with irritation, "maybe we should just agree to disagree. Yeah, this is a comedy show. Things are getting a little too intense. Why don't we talk about your new tour dates? Or something lighter?" His attempt to steer things back into promotional territory landed with the grace of a brick-through-glass dot. Cher didn't hesitate. Her reply came cool and surgical, too intense for a comedy show. She repeated the phrase as if tasting a tanned, finding it bitter. "Jimmy, the only thing too intense here is your inability to treat a guest with basic respect. You invited me on this show. You attacked my credibility. You dismissed my intelligence. And now you want to smile and pretend none of it happened." She stepped forward, slowly closing the space between them with deliberate calm. "You don't get to provoke and then pivot. Not this time." Her voice now carrying the full weight of 6 decades in entertainment, 6 decades of not backing down, cut through the room like thunder. "If this moment is too much for you, Jimmy, maybe the problem isn't the moment." And with that, she turned to the audience, not the cameras. The people, they erupted. Gasps, applause, shock, chaos. It was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. Cher stood her ground. A legend who had fought every battle twice, once for herself, once for everyone watching. "You know what, Jimmy?" she said, her voice steady but laced with fire. "I've done thousands of interviews. I've dealt with unprepared hosts, rude ones, indifferent ones, but never have I been invited on a show just to be systematically torn down under the disguise of fake smiles and comedy." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the camera operators sensed it. They were filming television history. Kimmel squirmed in his chair. His signature smirk had vanished. The quick wit, the confidence gone. "I think you're overreacting," he began weakly, but Cher was already speaking, cutting through his words like thunder rolling across a summer sky. "Overreacting?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Jimmy, I'm underreacting." She stepped forward. Her tone shifted from anger to hard-earned truth. "Do you have any idea what it's like to spend your whole career having men tell you your opinions don't matter? That you should stick to singing and looking pretty?" She paused. "I thought we were past that, but clearly some people never learn." Cher turned to the audience, her voice rising with the full force of 6 decades of defiance and dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this," she said, gesturing to Kimmel, "this is what disrespect looks like in 2025. It doesn't always come in the form of insults or slurs. Sometimes it comes wrapped in fake concern, ... and questions about whether you're qualified to speak on issues you've been fighting for longer than some people have been alive." The audience sat in stunned silence. Phones were already out, uploading, immortalizing the moment. Kimmel, face flushed and panicked, tried to salvage the wreckage. "Cher, I never meant to save it," she said flatly, cutting him off with surgical finality. "You meant every word. The only question is whether you're adult enough to own it." She walked calmly back to her chair, picked up her purse, and stood tall, every move deliberate, every gesture radiating purpose. "You know what's really sad, Jimmy," she said, turning back to him one last time. "I came here tonight excited to talk about my work, my new documentary, my tours, stories that might inspire people. But instead, I got ambushed by a man who clearly has no respect for his guests or their experiences." The silence in the studio was total, not even a cough, just the sound of truth ringing through the rafters. You have a platform that reaches millions. You could use it to lift people up, celebrate their journeys, start meaningful conversations about things that actually matter. But instead you chose to tear down a guest who came here in good faith. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Kimmel sat frozen speechless for the first time in his career. The man known for quips and comebacks was silenced by one woman's raw, unflinching honesty. "I've been in this business for over 60 years, Cher continued, her voice soft, now tinged with disappointment. "I've seen it grow. I've seen it become more inclusive, more respectful. But apparently, there are still corners of it stuck in the past where women are expected to smile, stay quiet, and be grateful just to be included." She reached the edge of the stage and turned back once more. To everyone watching at home, remember this moment. Respect isn't earned by staying quiet. It's earned by standing tall when someone tries to silence you. And it's something you give freely when others deserve it. Jimmy clearly doesn't understand either concept. And with that, Cher walked off the set, graceful, unshaken. Unapologetic, the only sound was the rhythmic echo of her heels. Against the studio floor, Kimmel sat motionless at his desk, the cameras still rolling, broadcasting his stunned silence to millions. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Clips of the confrontation dominated social media. #RespectShare began trending globally. Support poured in from fans, celebrities, activists, people who saw in Cher not just a music icon, but a voice for every woman who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or interrupted by mourning. Kimmel's ratings had cratered. Media outlets ran headlines like, "Cher destroys Kimmel in live showdown." Late-night legends schooled on respect, wit meets wisdom. Wisdom wins. The confrontation didn't just go viral. It redefined the moment. A warning shot to every host, anchor, or executive who still thought powerful. Women should sit quietly and smile. Cher didn't just walk off that stage. She walked into a new chapter of her legacy, one where her voice rang louder than ever.